Hello everyone and welcome to week 4. We just came off of a really busy week with our first critical task due, discussion, and the Module 3 exam. Our fourth week is going to be a little less hectic for you all since you'll just have some reading and discussion to do. I'll be working on this week on getting your first critical tasks graded, so be on the lookout for feedback on those. In Chapter 4, we looked at knowledge, evidence, and errors in thinking. We had a really interesting discussion about how different types of errors enter our thinking in everyday life. I think one of the more interesting types of errors is the self-serving biases. On page 113, Boss writes, "The misperception that we are in control of random events also plays out in superstitious behavior, such as wearing our lucky shirt during a big game or bringing a good luck charm to an exam." I don't know about you guys, but I tend to notice this kind of superstitious behavior often, especially in sports. But carrying that belief, the belief that we are in control of random events, too far can be disastrous, as we saw in the example where people refused to evacuate during wildfires and hurricanes. It's a real balance that we have to achieve. The self-serving bias error is one I really want you all to be aware of. I also think we need to pay special attention to the social errors and biases as well, since we can be really prone to making those despite our best efforts to think critically. The one that really scares me is the diffusion of responsibility. The example about Kitty Genovese is one I first heard about in a philosophy class many years ago, and we looked at that as an example of bystander syndrome. Everyone who heard her scream thought that somebody else had already reported it. I think Judith Both summarizes this really well on page 122 when she says, "As social beings, we are vulnerable to the one of us/one of them error, social expectations, and group conformity. When in groups, we also tend to regard something as not our problem, unless responsibility is assigned to us. Although these traits may promote group cohesiveness, they can interfere with effective critical thinking. As good critical thinkers, we need to be aware of these tendencies and to cultivate the ability to think independently while still taking into consideration others' perspectives." What I think is really interesting about Chapter 4 was the insight it gave us into how our minds work. There's so much we still don't know about how our brains work, but we're learning more every day. Being aware of how we can make cognitive, perceptual, and social errors is a step in the right direction, because we can use critical thinking to try and correct for those errors. So, at week 4, we've reached the halfway point of the term. Give yourselves a pat on the back. You deserve it. In week 4, the information we're going to start looking at is a little more technical. We've split Chapter 6 up into 2 weeks. Make sure you pay close attention to the first part of the chapter, which we're covering this week. Next week's material will build on what we are covering this week, so it's very important to stay on top of everything. The first thing I want to highlight from your text is the definition of an argument. According to your text, an argument refers to the use of reason and evidence to support a claim or conclusion. People make arguments all the time. In fact, in your critical task number 1, you were making an argument. You were using reasons to support your claim, which was your thesis. Sometimes it can be really difficult to pick out what an argument is. So what we're going to do in this module is learn how to identify arguments. We'll start by learning how to identify issues. Clarity is the key here, as we'll see with arguments. We want to be as clear as possible with our language, our intention, and our meaning when we are defining an issue. Sometimes that means we have to define terms, and that's okay. We want everyone to be on the same page so there's no confusion. So parts of an argument. An argument is always made up of 2 or more propositions, one of which, the conclusion, is supported by the other proposition, which we refer to as a premise. There are different types of arguments, and we'll look at these later on. Right now we just want to get the basics. A proposition is a statement that expresses a complete thought. Note that a proposition can be true or false. Your text gives you some examples of propositions. The earth revolves around the sun. God exists. Chris doesn't show me enough affection. Cheating on exams is wrong. Toronto is the capital of Canada. The propositions we just saw are all simple propositions. We can have compound propositions too, like the following. Marco is taking 4 courses this semester and is working in his parents' store 20 hours a week. The 2 propositions are, Marco is taking 4 courses this semester, and Marco is working in his parents' store 20 hours a week. Another compound proposition is the following. Kate is very smart, but not motivated to do well in school or try to find a job that uses her talents. How would we break down this compound? Kate is smart. Kate is not very motivated to do well in school. Kate is not motivated to find a job that uses her talents. Pay close attention in the text to what is not a proposition. Now let's discuss premises and conclusions. On page 172, we find out that the conclusion of an argument is the proposition that is supported or denied by the basis of other propositions or reasons. The conclusion is what the argument is trying to prove. The premise is a proposition that supports or gives reasons for accepting the conclusion. Reasoning goes from the premises to the conclusion. There are different types of premises. We have descriptive premises, which are based on empirical facts. An example is San Francisco is in California. There are prescriptive premises which contain value statements, such as it is wrong to eat animals. There are analogical premises which draw comparisons between two similar things. And then there are definitional premises. And these are usually definitions of a key term, and I want you to look at the affirmative action example on page 172. Remember that good premises are based on fact and experience, not opinion and assumptions. The more credible the premises are, the better the argument is likely to be. We also have non-arguments. There are 2 common ones that we see. One of them is an explanation. The cat yowled because I stepped on her tail. This just tells us that something occurred. And then we have conditional statements, or if-then statements. So if Francois comes from Montreal, then she understands French. Remember that conditional statements alone are not arguments, because there's no claim or conclusion that follows from that statement. But we will often see conditional statements appear as parts of arguments. There's a formula we should use to identify arguments. It includes breaking down the argument into propositions and then diagramming the argument. So here are the steps. Step 1, put brackets around each proposition. Step 2, identify the conclusion. Ask, what is this person trying to prove? Some keywords and phrases can clue us into the conclusion. Words like therefore, thus, so, for these reasons, it follows that, etc. Step 3 is identify the premises. There are premise indicators that are sometimes present that can help us with this. Since, because, given that. These are just a few common premise indicators. And then for step 4, we draw a double line under the conclusion and a single line under the premises. We circle any conclusion or premise indicators. Let's try an example. First, let's bracket our propositions. You can see that I've done that here. I also added some color, but in the event that we have colorblind students in the class, the only indicator you need is that the propositions are bracketed. Remember, the conclusion is a proposition too. Now, let's identify our conclusion. We see our conclusion indicator here. It's the word therefore. And we know that this is trying to prove that this person needs to move up to the front of the class. I put the conclusion in bold text for now. Now, step 3 asks us to identify the premises. Well, we have an indicator for one of them. Since I know, so there's one of the premises. And the other one is an example of empirical evidence. Students who sit in front of the class earn higher grades. There are 2 premises, which leads us to step 4. I've put a double underline under the conclusion, and I'm going to show you this here with the pen tool. So here's my conclusion, which has a double underline under it. Oops, kind of crossed it out a little bit. And then I've identified my premises here, right? Those are in brackets. So premise, and then I already have my premise and conclusion indicators circled. I hope that was a helpful demonstration. In your discussion this week, you're going to try to identify the premises and conclusion of an argument. This is a really important exercise, and paying close attention to this will set you up for success in the second half of the course.